Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. My name is George Talbot. I'm Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Research and Dean of Arts and Sciences here at Edge Hill University. You're very, very welcome if you come from outside the Edge Hill University community, or indeed from within it. A couple of public service announcements to begin with. If there were to be a fire alarm, we have 3 exits there and there and up at the back, and we don't expect to have a drill, so if the alarm does go off, that is where you would exit. The second one concerns your mobile phones. As we will be recording Geoff's lecture this evening, I would ask you please to switch off your mobile phones at this point. It gives me very great pleasure to welcome this evening Professor Geoff Beattie to deliver his inaugural lecture at Edge Hill University, University of the Year. I'm very proud to have been involved in the appointment of Geoff to Edge Hill University just over a year ago. He joined us after a distinguished academic career, first of all at the University of Sheffield and later at the University of Manchester, where he was head of the School of Psychology for a number of years. Geoff comes, as you'll tell from his accent, from the northern part of the island that I come from. And he studied at the University of Birmingham, first of all, taking a first-class degree in psychology and then continuing to the University of Cambridge, where he did his doctorate. It's difficult to know where to begin introducing Geoff. A scholar, a novelist, an athlete, a media commentator and pundit, expert on Big Brother and regular visitor to the couch and the BBC breakfast programme in the mornings. And indeed an athlete and a pugilist, all in the interests of his research. He is going to, well, I'm not going to tell you what he's going to speak about, he will do that himself. He's had a fascinating research career in which he's published, I've lost count of how many academic books and popular academic books as well. He's got terrific skills in terms of communication, which we will enjoy this evening, I think. In any case, you've come along to hear him rather than me, so I will hand over now to Professor Geoff Beattie. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for coming on a cold night. Let me start with a few confessions. Confession 1 is I've pinched the title. Some of you may recognize the title from a book R.D. Laing wrote in 1960. I think he was 26 when he wrote it. I always thought it was a brilliant title. I thought I'd use it one day, so I have. The second confession I have is I'm a bit of a technophobe. Videos never work, so I've got an assistant tonight who's going to be clicking the videos. They don't trust me with that bit. And I've got a third confession, which is I'm terribly nervous. I never get nervous before a lecture, but for some reason I'm nervous, and I think the introductions made me more nervous, so there'll be a bit of twitching. Okay, the debate itself. We're currently facing a number of major challenges to do with our relationship with the planet in terms of sustainability and climate change, and our relationship with each other in terms of prejudice, inequality, and conflict. Now, I want to suggest that some new ideas in psychology may help us reframe both sets of challenges and thereby act more effectively. So I'm sticking my neck out by saying new ideas. There's a famous quote from a very well-known British psychologist called Hans Eysenck years and years ago, talking about psychoanalysis. And what he said about psychoanalysis is that what's true isn't new, and what's new isn't true. So what I'm going to do tonight is tell you what other people have done and then try to tell you my little contribution, which is the new bit, and by the end of the evening you'll tell me if it's true or even plausible. Okay, so defining the issues first of all and imagining possible solutions. I think there is genuine frustration that these issues of climate change and racism have proven to be so intractable. World leaders, economists, social scientists, the commercial sector have all offered solutions. Every one of them's failed. And I want to ask, why is this? And I'm going to suggest that it's us that's the problem and how we think and act. We had a rehearsal of these slides a few minutes ago, and I suddenly realized it looked as if I was blaming the US there. But the US stands for us, sorry, not the US. They're too easy to blame, okay. And the first problem I'm going to be dealing with is climate change. So this is the first clip.
Life depends on the warmth of the sun being trapped by a layer of gases that surround the Earth. We now produce so much of these heat-trapping gases that the layer is getting thicker, heating the world, changing our climate and threatening our way of life. As the world gets hotter, the climate will change and some of the extreme effects we have witnessed will become more frequent, making our planet a more hostile place to live.
100 degrees Fahrenheit is the hottest day ever recorded in Britain.
If we could see the gases, the causes of the problem would be obvious to everyone. And if you could see the effect we are having on our planet, you'd do something about it. The solutions exist, and it's not too late to make a difference, but we have to act now, today. Government, industry, and individuals acting together to tackle the problem. For more information and to get involved, visit climatechallenge.gov.uk. Tomorrow's climate is today's challenge.
Okay, so that's the problem. So the scientific evidence on climate change is overwhelming. Stern Review, commissioned by Blair's government, suggests that climate change demands an urgent global response, and climate change threatens the basic elements of life for people around the world. The IPCC report last year said a rise in global temperature will have severe and widespread impacts, a major risk to global food production, and more extreme fluctuations in weather, including droughts, flooding, and storms. But there's something else, of course. Stern also said that human activities are a major driver of this rapid change in our climate, particularly patterns of consumption and energy use driven by consumer demand for higher standards of living. So this involves all of us. It's us who's changing the climate. Now, the weird thing is that governments seem to be getting the message, multinationals seem to be getting the message, but the people, generally speaking, don't. So here, I want to start off by using a little thing from Unilever just to show you the way that they've tried to address this problem and what they see as the remaining problem. So Unilever, of course, one of the top multinationals in the world. Turnover is 40 billion, which even shames Edgehill, I think. Sold in 190 countries, 2 billion times a day. Extraordinary statistic, 2 billion times a day, somebody uses one of their products. Now, if you look at their key performance indicators, of course, big multinational company, the key performance indicators, of course, are going to be financial primarily. They're looking for 5% growth, and that's some ways they're hoping to achieve that growth. But they see the problem of climate change. And I've heard the CEO of Unilever say this quote, and I've heard other members, it's almost like a mantra that's repeated throughout the organization. There's no profit from a dead planet. I love these people who are so commercially bound that they're thinking, well, if the planet's dead, we can't make any money. So they've got a sustainable living plan, which is we're living in a world where temperatures are rising, water is scarce, energy expensive, food supply is uncertain, and the gap between rich and poor increasing. Business must be part of the solution. Sustainable, equitable growth is the only acceptable business model. And they've got specific plans in place. In order to live within the natural limits of the planet, we will have to decouple growth from environmental impact. And that's true of a lot of multinationals. And our commitment is to halve the greenhouse gas impact of our products across the life cycle by 2020. So this is what they did. They reduced greenhouse gas emissions from the manufacturing chain, and that's a huge commitment. They reduced deforestation. They want to eliminate deforestation. They used more environmentally friendly sourcing of raw materials. They decoupled their use of they doubled their use of renewable energy. They produce concentrated liquids and powders. If you buy detergent now from Unilever, you know it comes in very small containers. They reduced greenhouse gas emissions from transport, gas emissions from refrigeration, reduced employee travel. They did all this, and they spent millions doing it. And then the bottom line in terms of greenhouse gas emission, what's happened? Our greenhouse gas footprint impact per consumer has increased by about 5%. So they've done all that, and it's gone up. So what's the problem? Well, this is what they say. They say those areas are under their control. They've sorted out. The bits not us haven't. So what's our problem? Well, our problem is waste, refrigeration, length of showers. Apparently in America, they spend far too long in the shower. I keep saying, let's find out what they're doing. Use of energy and why they choose the environmentally unfriendly alternatives. Consumers seem to be the problem. So the question is, as a psychologist, I'm interested in why people don't get the message. Well, the effects are less personal than some other things that are happening around us. It's primarily about future generations. So what is it about human beings that they can't imagine our children's children's children, and so on? It's easy to shift responsibility. We did some research a few years ago looking at what happens if you chopped up Al Gore's film, An Inconvenient Truth, played it to people. There's a wonderful clip about China. As soon as you play that clip, people think it lets them off the hook. There's uncertainty about the time course, and of course, powerful lobbies are behind this. And before I came today, I reread the tobacco argument. And honestly, if you're ever bored, and you've got obviously nobody in Edge Hill University would be bored, we have far too much to do. But if you're ever bored and you've got time in your hands, just read the tobacco books about the tobacco industry in the early 1960s. Everyone knew it caused cancer, but there was this wonderful counter-arguments being generated by the big tobacco firms who had public relations consultants buying scientists to plant doubt about the relationship. And there's a wonderful book called Merchants of Doubt, which is on this very topic. And the psychologist I mentioned earlier, incredibly in the 1990s, was going around British universities saying, smoking doesn't give you lung cancer. Certain personalities are prone to smoking, and certain personalities are prone to lung cancer, and it's all your personality. It's not, it's extraordinary, and it was discovered much later that he got millions from the tobacco industries for that proposition. But the same thing's happening now, of course, with climate change. But climate change is also complicated. And also I say it's about the emotional valence of global warming. I think global warming sounds lovely. In the sense that if you go out in Ormskirk some nights, it's bloody freezing, and you keep thinking a bit of global warming would be okay. Who doesn't want to warm up? And weirdly, when you ask people when the temperature gets a bit miserable about global warming, they're less worried about it. Surprise, surprise. It's too catastrophic to contemplate. So it's hard, but not impossible, to do something about it. And some people have said, well, look, we know it's hard, but we just need to read people better. And there are a lot of people out there, including governments and multinationals, saying, look, all we have to do is read people, and then we'll sort the problem out. Now, this is where I come in as a psychologist. I think they've done some mind reading, and I think they've got it wrong, and I want to suggest what they might do instead. So this is what they say. The first step is we need to be able to read the mind of the consumer, to ascertain what's possible and what's not, to understand their motives and intentions, to assess how likely they are to change their patterns of consumption, and to decide whether they can break long-established habits and routines. It all seems sensible. Now, it might seem difficult. I think any mind reading is difficult. But an extraordinary number of influential people and organizations think it's possible. Now, tonight's lecture is going to say, I'm going to argue it's more difficult than it might appear because consumers don't have a mind. They have two. They've got two distinct cognitive systems, each with its own properties and mode of operation, and one of these isn't open to introspection. Now, let me show you some great mind readers in action. Terry Leahy, the CEO of Tesco in 2007, announced a call to arms to tackle climate change. And Tesco were going to lead the way on this. A great not so great multinational. No, they've had a few little scandals there since, but never mind. But Lee's message was simple but profound. We need a green revolution. The green movement must become a mass movement in green consumption. We must empower everyone, not just the enlightened or the affluent. It's easy to get people here to agree to do things. It's different when you have the public as a whole. And his critical point was, and I heard him saying this many times, consumers want to do more in the fight against climate change if only we can make it easier and more affordable. And he would point to numerous market research surveys which supported this. Things like 70% of people agreed if there's no change in the world, we will soon experience a major environmental crisis. And 78% of people say they're prepared to change the behavior to help limit climate change. So Leahy said, look, job done. DEFRA, the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs in the UK, said, of course, very sensibly, policy action needs to be rooted in understanding and awareness of consumer behavior. And their strategy was to focus on people's ability to act and on their willingness to act. But again, they were also mind readers. They said they were reading minds. Many people are willing to do more to limit their environmental impact. They have a much lower level of understanding about what they can do and what would make a difference. So the multinationals were reading minds, the government was reading minds. This was all going to be so easy. So in 2007, 2008, they introduced this in supermarkets. And this is a light bulb, and what it does on the left, it shows you the carbon footprint. And the idea was, it says, consumers are rational people. We all want to save the planet. We know what people's attitude is. People will go to supermarkets, they will look at the carbon footprint, they will look at the carbon footprint of alternatives, they will buy the low carbon alternative, and we're all going to be on the earth forever. And let me just say, this was a huge undertaking. This was the start of the Green Revolution. So I was there, I was in the streets with my green banner. So this was to be led by consumer demand, because as a marketeer, Leahy was saying the consumers will decide what they want, and then the production will change to give the consumers what they want. And all the consumers said they wanted was information, and that was going to be it. And Leahy also said, listen, this works with food. If you put calories on food, people look. And Laura and I did some research looking at people looking at chocolate Easter eggs. Does anybody know how many calories is in a chocolate Easter egg, by the way? Too many. Have a guess. I was shocked to find. Yeah? 1,000? Yeah. I was amazed. 1,200 and quite a small one. 1,200 calories, like a daily allowance, just buy a chocolate Easter egg. You can get through the day. And when people look at chocolate Easter eggs, if they're concerned about things like that, they do look. So Leahy said, look, this does work. And Tesco had many examples of this. So they had planned to label all 70,000 of their products with a carbon footprint. And this was enormous, because it took several months to calculate the carbon footprint of each individual product. And it had to be validated by the Carbon Trust. And consumers, the idea was, should now choose the low carbon footprint alternatives. This was going to be the start of the Green Revolution. But how did consumers actually behave? They didn't do what they thought. And talk about frustration. And then something else even worse happened. We did a little bit of research in which we showed people carbon labels, and we tracked their eyes. Now, there are some eye tracking experts in the audience tonight, so I'll be looking forward to some questions. Now, so they're looking at the products. We looked at where they looked. So this is how, and the little fly buzzing around is the individual fixation points. And you can see that's the carbon footprint they're looking at. They're looking at some information, which isn't bad. Okay, they look. And if you look at how much time they looked about 89.1% of the time other things. And they looked at carbon footprint about 7.6%, carbon footprint information about 3.3% overall. But what was really scary was there are certain things they looked at. Show them an energy efficient light bulb, yeah. They'll look at the carbon footprint there. Show them a carrier bag, yeah, I'll look at that. Show them other things, they hardly look at all. And that's us looking at different products. The yellow is the light bulb. The orangey thing is the orange juice. Very good. And the blue is the liquid detergent. You can see the carbon footprint liquid detergent, hardly looked at all. They didn't buy the products. And when they went to the supermarket, despite this millions of pounds spent labeling it, they didn't look at the carbon footprint. So nothing changed. Now the question is, was this mind reading ever justified? Leahy and DEFRA based their strategy on data on consumer attitudes. And what I'm going to say to you, there's not going to be many technical terms tonight, but this is one. Attitudes is the key. If we want to understand the concept of attitude, if we want to understand what people are going to do, we measure their attitude. And the kind of founder of experimental social psychology was a psychologist called Gordon Allport. And he defined an attitude as a mental and neural state of readiness organized through experience exerting a directive or dynamic influence upon the individual's response to all objects and situations with which it's related. So it's a state of readiness, and this is the core concept. It's core to so much in our everyday lives, this notion of an attitude. Now, the big question is, how do we measure it? Now, the way it was done for 60 or 70 years in psychology was very, very simple. It was based on a scale called the Likert scale, devised by an American psychologist called Rensis Likert, who measured attitudes to ethnicity in the US in the 1920s. And the idea was you simply get people to introspect and report their preferences. You simply ask them, what is your attitude? And then they report it for you. Now, I always like to point out that Allport was a great experimental psychologist. He was also a person who wrote a lot about his life. And if you ever want to understand why we measure attitudes like that, all you have to do is read Allport's autobiography. Because he tells a wonderful story about when he just graduated from Harvard at 22. He wrote to Freud, who was famous then, in 1920, and visited Freud in his study in Vienna. He got into Freud's study, and Freud, being a psychoanalyst, was silent temporarily. Psychoanalysts, I'm sure there might even be one in the audience, like silence. Victor, we were talking about silence today, wherever you are. And Allport was a very shy boy, and he thought, oh my God, silence. It's the worst thing in the world. So he thought he'd fill the silence by something. And he filled the silence by telling a story of what had happened to him on the tram. He said he was on the tram to Freud's office, and there was a boy who had a kind of tantrum because this man tried to sit beside him. And the boy kept screaming that the man was dirty. Okay, and then Allport said, and he noticed that the boy's mother was starched. Starched is the word he used. Ultra clean. And Allport said, I think the reason it happened was the mother was obsessed with cleanliness. It all came from the mother. Now, Allport said he only told the story because he was trying to fill the silence. So Freud was silent again, and then smiled at him with his very kind eyes in Allport's language, and said, and was that dirty little boy you? And Allport was appalled because Freud had tried to psychoanalyze him. So Freud thought this was a story about himself. And it's kind of funny, if you read the psychoanalytic literature since then, other psychoanalysts said he was the dirty boy because he had written to Freud pretending he was a bigger academic than he was. He was only just a recent graduate. But Allport left Freud's study talking about psychoanalytic excess. What Allport said is, we can't delve too deeply into the unconscious. It's much easier just to ask people to report their motives. And for 70 years, that's what he got people doing. So we asked people to report their motives, and this is one of our first studies into sustainability. You ask people about high carbon and low carbon. 5 means I much prefer low carbon to high carbon. This is what you get. People say, yes, they do. If you ask people to report their attitude, that's what you find. But Allport also said often an attitude seemed to have no representation in consciousness other than a vague sense of need or some indefinite or unanalyzable feeling of doubt, assent, conviction, effort, or familiarity. So Allport earlier on was saying, hang on a second, there might be an unconscious aspect. But following what Freud did to him, he seemed to have ignored it. Now the question is, it's always uncomfortable for a psychologist to mention the unconscious. You know, it's okay in drama or literature or media, but for psychologists it's a little bit uncomfortable because the question is, what can we build out of it? Can we build a science out of it? That's the challenge. And now one advance, I think, in this direction is the kind of growing recognition that there are 2 systems of the human mind. And what's really helped this way of thinking is that one of the people who are behind this idea is the Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman. As I'm sure everyone knows, there's no Nobel Prize in psychology. Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for economics, and there's only one other psychologist at UCL called John O'Keefe who won it for physiology and medicine. And what Kahneman says is, look, if you want to understand the human mind, you need to recognize that there's not one system, but two. One system is automatic, fast, impulsive, unintended, and unconscious, and one's intentional, slow, controlled, reflective, and conscious. Now let me demonstrate system one and system two of the human mind. I'm going to show you some faces, and I want you to shout out what the emotion is in the face as soon as you recognize it. Now, it's not a trick, and the 6 emotions are happiness, sadness, anger, fear, disgust, and surprise. So there's no blends possible. You can't shout it. It's sadness with a touch of surprise. Right, that's far too sophisticated. Let me also warn you, the first time I ever did this was in a lecture theatre like this, and I showed the first clip, which is not the first one you're going to see, and the person, and I kid you not, shouted out, I said, what's the emotion? Someone shouted out, constipation. No, I thought the person was being funny, but they weren't. And I said, constipation isn't an emotion. And they said, well, sorry, I think I misunderstood the question then. But, so constipation doesn't count, okay? So if you see constipation, keep it to yourself. Okay. So just, as soon as, and I'm public participant, as soon as you see it, just shout it out, okay? And the clips are all wonderful originals from Ekman from the 1960s. So the hairstyles, it's all 1964. Okay, right, so are you ready? As quickly as you can. Okay, did we have 2 surprises? That was surprise. Everyone agree? Fear, yeah. Sometimes people confuse a few of them, but we do it pretty quickly. Now, I've asked you to do a similar thing. Just shout out whether it's a man or a woman, right? Someone's playing tricks. Okay, well, and the point is we do it as quickly as we can detect, whether someone's a man or a woman, what color. I could ask you what color. We do emotion pretty quickly. So system one, that's system one thinking. We do that without reflecting. You don't have to work it out. So orient to the source of a sudden sound. That's system one. Complete the phrase bread and butter. 2 and 2. Ooh. Recognize that brash and confident with a passion for success suffers little guilt in their dealings with people, resembles an occupational stereotype. So I kept thinking of that as a used car salesman. I ran it past a very close friend, and they said, Vice Chancellor? I wasn't sure about that, but the idea is that we recognize what the conglomeration of characteristics are. We can put something to it. Now, system 2 is very different. I need a volunteer for this one. So I'm going to demonstrate system 2 thinking. Yeah, you'll do it. Yeah, go ahead. Right, okay. 17 times 24.
How long do you have to answer?
As long as you need. 408 is very good, yeah. Right, so that wasn't quite as quick as happiness, sadness, etc. So whatever you're doing is conscious, controlled, reflective, intentional, slow. Some people would have taken a little bit to do that. So that's system 2. Okay, system 2 is also look for the VC in the audience. He wasn't here, so that's why I could do the joke. Is he here? No. Tell someone your phone number. Compare 2 university psychology departments for ref scores. That's a bit of an in-joke for those from psychology. Check out the validity of a complex logical argument. That's all system 2. That's the kind of conscious, intentional, slow system, but there's system 1 thinking as well. Now, it seems to me that if you want to understand people, the relationship between these 2 systems is pretty critical. System 1 consciously generates suggestions for system 2, impressions, intuitions, and feelings. If endorsed by system 2, they turn into voluntary actions. So system 1's always working, suggesting things. System 2 can turn them into voluntary actions. When system 1 runs into difficulties and calls on system 2 for more detailed processing, so if you've got trouble doing something, system 2 will step in. And when system 1 has no answer, which is rare, system 2 is mobilized. So that's all pretty good so far. But there's a couple of other things. First of all, system 2 is easily depleted. And this is the work of Roy Baumeister. Self-control and cognitive effort are both forms of mental work that trade off each other. So when you concentrate hard, when you're working hard mentally, you're more likely to show low self-control. That's why, if you can remember your student days, or students can remember last night, you're more likely to choose chocolate cake than fruit when you're thinking hard. It's like you've very little self-control. And system 1 has got a very sweet tooth indeed. It's just an evolutionary system for getting sugar. When you show high self-control, for example, inhibiting emotional responses, you perform less well on cognitive tasks. And something else as well. Now, I'm going to show you another problem, and you have to say whether you've seen it before, because obviously this is not new. I've taken this from Kahneman. So I need a volunteer. I'll not ask you, because your mental arithmetic's too good. Can we ask someone who's not a psychologist? Anyone have a go? Emily, you will do. You're not a psychologist. Right, okay, but have you seen this before? So as quickly as possible, a bat and ball cost £1.10. The bat costs £1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Quickly as you can. Have you seen this before? You are a smart woman. 5p. Most people, Emily, you were a bad choice. You were a bad choice. Okay, people tend not to check. Most people say, the bat costs £1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? What do you think most people say? 10p. 80% of university students give the wrong answer. And according to Kahneman, 50% of Harvard students give the wrong answer. So people tend not to check. It kind of looks intuitively right to say £1 and 10p. They go for that. But it's 5p because you need 5 plus 1, 105, gives you 110. So what happens is system 2 endorses an intuitive answer that it could have rejected with a small investment. So the point is system 2 can be very lazy. According to Kahneman, this judgment is harsh but not unfair. So that's the systems. Right, now I want to show you, and this is the critical bit, how does system 1 work? And I apologize about the example. It's a great example. It's not mine. And those of you who like fruit, I do apologize. Bananas. Everyone love bananas? Okay, bananas, vomit. Okay, what's happened to you? This is the great associative machine which underpins system 1. You experienced unpleasant images or feelings. Anyone get pleasure from that? No. Okay, your face registered disgust. I could see your faces. You couldn't. Your heart rate went up. Your mind assumed a causal connection between the two words. You think bananas, vomit. Ooh, it can make you sick. You will have experienced a temporary aversion to bananas. And the state of your memory has changed. So I'm going to, again, as soon as you can fill in the blank in this, just shout it out. Complete the following word. You ready? Sick. You thought something different? Yeah. Ooh. Come and see me afterwards. Most people say sick. I did this at Christmas with one of my sons, and he went, Christmas, get it? Sack. Present. But you've just had bananas and vomit, sick. You're more likely to recognize objects and concepts associated with vomit. This is called priming. And recognize words associated with bananas. Basically, you want to survive. Because you're going through life now thinking bananas, vomit, sickness, anything that could potentially be connected with sickness, I'm going to fill in the details. And actions, not just thoughts, can be primed by... I'm starting to feel a bit nauseous, by the way. Do apologize. Actions, not just thoughts, can be primed by events of which you're not even aware. So it's not just that you can prime thoughts with something like that. You can even prime people's actions. Now, let me show you a little example of this. And this is based on an experiment by Holland. And this is a crumbly biscuit experiment. You give someone a crumbly biscuit to eat. And then you prime them either with the smell of lemon or no smell of lemon. This was we just did a little film of this. And you can hear an RA of mine spraying the room with lemon in one. Now, it's a great little story because it's something that psychologists use called the waiting room technique. Someone turns up for an experiment. You say, we're not quite ready for you yet. So just take a seat. And they look miserable. And she looks very miserable. Then she's told she's going to get a biscuit to eat. And she goes like this. You'll see it. And she gets a biscuit. Now, the prediction is when it's primed with the smell of lemon, she's more likely to clean. If you ask people what they're planning to do that night in a room smelling of lemon, they're more likely to say, I'm going to go home tonight, make my dinner, do a bit of cleaning. And incredibly, if you do this crumbly biscuit, a slight smell of lemon, when they make a mess, as she does, they clean up after themselves. And I'm going to show you someone primed with lemon and then someone not primed with lemon and the difference. So you'll hear the spray in a minute. That's the spray. There's the assistant. Extraordinary. Student cleaning up. Right, so she's been primed with a lemon smell. And it's obviously the most exciting thing that's ever happened to her. Okay, so that's one. Right. Okay, so this is the second one. This one has not been primed with the lemon smell. The second one has not. And watch what she does. She doesn't care. So it's all over the floor. Okay, right. So that's just demonstrating priming. Okay, back to bananas and vomit. You experienced mild surprise. This was automatic. And this is associative activation. Ideas evoke, trigger other ideas in a spreading cascade of activity in your brain. So in summary, your system one made as much sense as possible of the situation, linking concepts in a causal story. It evaluated the possible threat by evaluating how surprising it was. It needed to know, when is this likely to happen again? It prepared you for events that have just become more likely. You were more likely to recognize sick, etc. It created a context for the current system. You ended up as informed about the past and as prepared for the future as you could be. Your associative machine did all that. That's pretty amazing stuff. So the human mind is comprised of two systems that work on different principles. The interaction is critical. One system is conscious, and that's the reflective bit, and we think reflects our true selves, but you can demonstrate it's very lazy. And the other is this unconscious side, this side that responds to priming and hidden from us, and it's a bit of a workaholic. It works all the time. But and this is the new bit where I've tried to explore the issues here. What's the long-term legacy of this, especially the system one work? How do these associations work across time? How do they shape our attitudes and behavior? And do we all have unconscious implicit attitudes based on this associative activation over time? Now, the big breakthrough in psychology was when someone finally said, how can we measure these attitudes that elude conscious introspection? I got some funding from Tesco to look at this. And the answer is by measuring associations directly in a computerized classification task. For example, how quickly you can associate high and low carbon with good and bad. It seems to be harder to associate certain categories rather than others. And I'm going to demonstrate that. I'm going to ask you to, again, by way of a demonstration, I want you to slap your left hand if the thing in the middle corresponds to the thing on the top left, and your right hand, not on someone's head, on the chair, if it corresponds to the thing at the top right. Okay? So that's so bang now. Left or right? So left. So that's a low carbon. Yeah? Everyone got that? So is glorious good or bad? Easy? Yeah. Now, you're going to see things joined together now. And you have to decide whether that is good or high carbon or bad or low carbon. It's slightly more complicated. So obviously what you're saying is a light bulb, so it doesn't correspond to good or bad. You have to categorize that as high carbon or low carbon. Do you get it? So left, if it's, I don't know how I can work out if you've just slapped your left or your right. I'll just have to look. Right, so slap your leg if it's left, if it's high carbon or good, low carbon or bad. Do you see? Okay. Glorious, is that good or high carbon? So it's good. Boom, left. Boom. Do you see? You have to work it out. But you can see what they're doing is they're pairing up the concept high and low carbon with good or bad. Now, the weird thing is, if you do this accurately, people find certain associations quicker than others. Okay, there's another one. Bang. Bang. It goes on and on. It goes on endlessly. And what you then do is you work out the difference in time to respond. The D score, if your implicit attitude to low carbon is positive, then you should respond quicker to low carbon paired with good compared with high carbon paired with good, and high carbon paired with bad versus low carbon paired with bad. It just works out differences in reaction time, and there's a penalty if you make mistakes. Now, once you do that, you get apparently a measure of implicit attitude, and we can talk afterwards about what it's really a measure of, if it's a measure of something else. But what's interesting is if you look at people's prediction of behavior, this measure is called an IAT measure, is a better predictor of spontaneous behaviors when behavior is under cognitive, emotional, or time pressure, and a better predictor of behavior in sensitive domains, as you'll see. Now, first of all, let me show you what it looks like. Now, this is the attitude. This is people's reported attitude to carbon footprint. This is why Leahy and DEFRA have spent millions of pounds saying, people say their attitude to low carbon is what you want. When you run the IAT, you get something a little bit different. You get something like this. Have I got a light? No, I forgot. No preference is the highest, that's the middle score. But this time you can see that preference for high carbon, there are more things to the left. When you look at people's reaction times to pair things with good and bad, you seem to get something different to what people report. It looks as if people's implicit attitudes to high carbon is more positive than their attitudes to low carbon using that technique. Now, to me, that is extraordinary because it raises immediately enormous issues. Everything we've based our judgment on so far, which is getting people to report attitudes and then going to the expense of carbon labelling, doing all these government campaigns, might have been completely a waste of time because they haven't measured this and thought about the implications of this. Now, what I also want to suggest is it any wonder that we're so deep in our unconscious, so pro-high carbon? What I'm going to say to you is that we've all grown up on a culture and been socialized to think that high carbon means success, status. And we know in evolutionary terms, success and status are important things. Okay, so first of all, how do these connect? There's no significant correlation between the measures. Explicitly stated attitudes and these implicit associations appear to be statistically dissociated. And of course, this raises the interesting issue that there may be many surface greens out there with a reported positive attitude to low carbon, but a positive implicit attitude to high carbon. Now, what I want to say to you, first of all, in terms of how we can make a contribution is understanding these conflicted individuals may be critical to doing anything about climate change because they may be very, very common. And they've been miscategorized by everyone so far. DEFRA, Tesco, everyone's read these people wrong. Now, how can we identify these surface greens? Well, we can study the detailed way in which they talk, but not focusing on just the words they use, but on their behavior. Now, one bit of behavior I'm really interested in is these weird things that people do when they talk, these gestural movements they make when they talk. Because the gestural movements, and it's weird because now I'm talking about it, I've had to pass the bunker over, are spontaneous. They're multidimensional. They're meaningful without the benefit of a lexicon. We make meaning in our hands without the benefit of a lexicon. And they're unconscious and therefore less open to editorial control. When you ask people what they've just gestured about, you say, what did that gesture mean? They can't tell you. Now, it's not gestures like this. If I come in today and go like this, I get told off because that is not good. That's different. That means peace. That means something else. Mrs. Thatcher occasionally went from that to that. And people said, well, she's still trying to do peace, but obviously not. Now, these gestures often back up speech, but they sometimes contradict it. And when the contradiction happens, these are called gesture speech mismatches. And for the last few years, I've been looking at gesture speech mismatches. And they occur because basically gestures are unconscious meaning unconsciously expressed. Lots of evidence on this. I'm going to cut through this story very quickly. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of examples of this, of gesture speech mismatches. Now, as George said, I worked on Big Brother for a number of years. And what's interesting about Big Brother, of course, people are watching what they say all the time. But occasionally, the gesture would contradict what they were saying in their speech. Now, one thing that we often do when we talk about relationships is that we say, of course, I'm close to my partner, blah, blah, blah. Our hands also do that. So when say you're close to your partner and you are really close, we're really close, it's like that. Not so close, like that. Had a bit of a wobbler. Hate their guts. And this is a really interesting example from Big Brother. This is a guy in the diary room talking about how close he is to the other housemates. He has to nominate them. If you listen to what he says, you believe he's really close to them. Watch his hand movements.
I can't explain why, well, yes, I will, but just let me say that it's been very difficult. It sounds like a cliche because judges say this at talent contests and things like that. It's been very difficult. We are, all six of us, very, very close, really close.
No, he wasn't. And of course, I got a chance to talk to him. I said, how close were you, Les? Hated them. No, but of course, if you were just basing your analysis on what he said, then you'd completely miss that. Now, here's another example of me analysing politicians. This is Tony Blair talking about rises national insurance contributions to funded developments in the NHS right through the last Parliament and will continue to fund them through the next Parliament. And his gesture said, funded them through the last Parliament, and then said, we'll continue to fund them to the next Parliament. The gesture should have continued. But it went like this, funded them through the last Parliament, just went, just stopped. So again, it raises some interesting issues. And I've been doing a lot of work recently on deception and gestures. Oh, there's a great book. Oh, that's called priming. All right. All right. Okay. But what had never been, again, let's differentiate what's new and what's old. This had never been done before. Nobody had ever thought to take people whose implicit and explicit attitudes clash and study their hand movements. Because don't forget, what I'm saying is that Tesco and Defra believed you could really take what people say on trust, spent millions doing carbon labeling. I'm saying, I think people have an unconscious mind. People don't know what their unconscious mind's doing. So I thought, I study speech and gesture, I'll study these people's speech and gesture. And I got a lot of people in, and these people, I knew what their implicit attitude was because I'd run them on that computerized test, and I knew what they reported. And some people, she's a true green. She says, I believe in the environment, I have a preference for low carbon. I'd measured her attitude, she does. I'm going to contrast that with someone who says she cares and doesn't. And I want to show something weird happening in the gesture. So watch what she says. She's talking about choice in the supermarket between high carbon and low carbon.
Yeah, if it was like really nice, it was really low, but it was the same product, but there was a difference in price, then I'd probably still feel really guilty about buying the carbon ones, but buying the low.
Okay, a little bit of mundane action. She says, I feel guilty about buying the high, I'd buy the low. She'd put the low in the left-hand space, and she's reaching for it. Okay? What's the next one? I call her a surface green. She says she's green, she isn't, believe me.
So they were next to each other, and it was quite obvious one was good and one was bad, and you go for the good one.
She's reaching out for the bad one. Her unconscious mind's directing her hand movement to grab that bad one. And I know this girl, when she's in Tesco, she's grabbing the bad ones. And extraordinarily, we've got 2,000 years of culture. We study people's language, what they say. People have never tried to examine these spontaneous movements as indicative of something meaningful and important. Now, is it surprising? What I said to you, the problem is we've been socialized to believe that high carbon lifestyles are very, very positive things connected with success and status. And here's a little film again that some of my RAs made. So you see the point, which is, you know, and people are going around reporting it's low carbon, they care about the environment, they're going to do this, they're going to do that. The carbon footprint was on, they didn't choose it, and what I'm arguing, of course, we've had, you know, decades of being socialized to believe that high status is a great thing, and we've internalized it. So the implications of this immediately raises issues about methods to reveal attitudes. You know, before DEFRA or Tesco do a campaign again, how should you test attitudes? Some methods may provide misleading results, and it suggests that many people are psychologically dissociated when it comes to environment and climate change. Implications for modeling the human mind. How do these systems influence behavior? How do they interact? How do you change them? And how do you appeal to them? And this is some of the work we've been doing over the last couple of years. We've been looking at how implicit attitudes to carbon footprint predicts choice of low carbon or high carbon products. We ran a very simple experiment. We measured people's attitudes. They told us they were very pro low carbon. Before they were going, we said, here, choose a goodie bag. This one or this one. They didn't know what it was about. And lo and behold, the implicit attitude predicted the choice of the low carbon goodie bag. What they reported had no impact whatsoever. And we've done some work on playing visual stimuli to people to see what they notice. In other words, if you should, you know, why is it that we're not getting all these climate change messages? Well, people seem not to pick up on the information. But we've done work which suggests that your implicit attitude predicts what you notice. Your reported attitude has no effect whatsoever. And I think this is going to be critically important. I'll just skip these couple of things quickly because of time. Oh, another great book. Oh, we'll linger on that. Okay, because I want to get on to this topic as well, because climate change is one thing I've been working on, but of course, this applies to other domains as well. Could it apply to issues to do with ethnicity and race? Could there be some kind of dissociation here? And I know that this is a very sensitive and delicate topic, but I think it's a really, really important topic. I mean, the first thing that strikes you, and I know that there are people here who are interested in race and history, but if you look into historical aspects of people's attitudes to race, it looks as if at some point there's a dramatic shift in attitudes between the 1940s and 1960s. In the 1940s, 35% said it was acceptable to have a black neighbour, 64% in 1962. Things changed dramatically. The question is, what actually happened? Did they change, or were people just too nervous to report them, or did something slightly more complex happen there? So this got me thinking about how this work might apply to this domain, and I wanted to start off by asking, is there some kind of ethnic or racial bias in this area? And I wanted to start off, but not by asking people what they say about stuff, but I wanted to look at actual behavior. And one thing you can look at is, take the domain of employment. Some psychologists have sent out CVs to try to gain employment and experimentally manipulated the CVs. You send the same CV with either a white or a non-white name on it and see what happens. And the answer is something significant happens. So this is a real-life study. This is a field study. They sent 5,000 CVs out in the US to genuine job adverts in Boston, Chicago. White candidates were 50% more likely than non-white candidates to be offered an interview. And in the UK, again, more applications had to come from the black and minority ethnic candidates. So it looks as if something's going on. So there seems to be some sort of bias, but doesn't identify the type of bias or the processes involved. Now, could this bias be operating closer to home? Could it be happening in universities? Well, this is an even more sensitive topic because we always think of universities as meritocratic institutions. It's all done on merit, of course it is. And yet, when I started this work in 2009, it looks as if there was a bit of an issue about underrepresentation of people from black and minority ethnic groups, particularly at the higher levels. And there's some basic statistics there about number of professors and VCs. The Journal of Blacks in Higher Education in the US said blacks in faculty ranks will not reach parity with the black percentage of the overall American workforce for another 140 years. Now, of course, in universities, there were attempts at solution, just as there's attempts to monitor gender bias. And there were operational performance reviews with close monitoring of the data, race and leadership reports, and women in leadership reports and recommendations, career development advice, and mentoring. After 3 years of activity, there was still minimal change at senior level. So could there be some kind of implicit bias related to race or ethnicity operating in society, even operating in universities? Now, The psychologist here is called Anthony Greenwald, and he's got a website on the Harvard University site called Project Implicit, and you can go on there and have a go at measuring what your possible implicit bias in this domain might be. And he says there looks as if there is some kind of bias in society. White people seem to have a preference, a pro-white preference, and black people in the US seem to have a pro-white preference, but much smaller. In terms of where it might come from, by the way, if you look at the psychological literature on this, all levels are pointed to. People talk about the emotional response to out-group versus own group. So people say it's to do with fear, it's to do with strangeness, it's a biological response. Allport himself talked about the psychological pull of the familiar. Other people say it's all to do with interaction, your early experiences, and other people say it's to do with culture. So you take your pick. It's probably affected by all four things. But what are the implications of this bias? The effects on behaviours are less clear, and this was the starting point for my own research, funded by the Equality Challenge Unit. The first thing I wanted to do was to see if there is indeed an implicit attitude to race or ethnicity. And I started off by thinking the ones that were on the Harvard site weren't very good. These are some of the images on there. And I thought they were terrible images because, to me, they looked terribly threatening, actually. All of them, they're too close. It's like someone standing in your face. So I thought, what happens if you get rid of these threatening images and put just nice, happy, smiley people? You can imagine people like that putting their face on a CV, send it into you. Okay? And then I measured what people reported. Some of the questions were very straightforward. Do you prefer whites to non-whites on a Likert scale? And I used other measures as well of self-report attitude. And then I did the IAT again. Same as before, you had to categorize and we measured your D-score. Now, when you do that, you find something, again, very interesting. If you ask people on a Likert score to say what their preference is in terms of ethnicity, none. Everyone's equal. 3, the mid response, which is I like both equally, is by far the commonest response. When you do the IAT, you get something really different. Anything between minus 0.2 and 0.2 is considered neutral. Very few people fall within that category. And if you look at the average score, the average Likert score was 3.18, close to the average. The average D score was 0.73 overall, and the average D score of the white participants is 0.87. Anything above 0.8 is considered a strong implicit response. So the question is, what's the implications of this? Well, I tried to look at behavior by doing an experiment around people being selected for jobs. And one of the jobs was an academic position, the other an admin position. And I constructed a whole series of CVs, and the important thing is, like most CVs, they had good bits and bad bits. The good bits was good degree, good publications, high-ranking journals. The bad bits was 2-2, less good journals, gaps in employment history. And that would be like a page of publications. So the top bit is publications in Health Psychology Newsletter. Derek, where are you, Derek? How would you rate that?
Not too highly.
The Psychologist?
Not too highly.
British Medical Journal?
Not bad.
Yeah. You can see, yeah. So exactly like that. So not so good journals, good journals. So we asked people to read the CVs, and then we give them a minute to make up their mind. And during that minute, we tracked their eyes. Now, this is the really interesting bit. And after they saw the 4, they had to pick 2. Now, what they didn't know was they were identical CVs. The names were just changing. So nobody saw the same CV from 2 different people, but we rotated them through the sample. I'll not play the clip. This is just a clip with a bit showing you where the eye tracking is. And that shows you some of the things. You can see that this lady's headscarf is of enormous interest. A lot of fixation on the headscarf. And I call this exploratory, but we analysed 240,000 individual gaze fixation points. Now, what did we find? Well, people are not colorblind. 77% of for our white participants, 77%, now don't forget these were identical CVs. 77% of the shortlisted candidates were white. 60% of our white participants shortlisted 2 whites. They had to pick 2 out of 4. 60% of the white participants picked 2 whites. White participants were 10 times more likely to shortlist 2 white candidates than 2 non-white. The non-white participants, 61% were non-white, 68% chose 1 white and 1 non-white. So there was a color, people were not colorblind. The pattern of the bias was different with white and non-white participants. You can see that the BME applicants came from a different set of ethnic backgrounds. Now, what was interesting then was if you start trying to look at people who have shortlisted 2 whites and 2 non-whites, if you look at their reported attitudes, absolutely no difference. Look at their measure from that computer test. Those who shortlisted 2 whites had a higher D score. Those who shortlisted 1 white and 1 non-white, middle, shortlisted 2 non-whites, going into the neutral zone. And again, for the non-white participants, some of the non-white participants picked 2 white candidates, and they tended to have the higher implicit score. And what was really interesting was if you then eye track them to see where they look, this is good information is blue, bad information is red for white candidates and non-white. People were more likely to look at the good information of the people from the same ethnic background as themselves. And I kind of love this because it's almost as if our rational mind's saying the information, because you may be called upon to do something with it. I'll skip that one now. So the ethnicity of the person making the judgment seems to influence who is shortlisted for academic posts. The non-academic post didn't have that colour bias. Self-reported attitude has no effect on who's shortlisted. Implicit attitude does seem to affect who's shortlisted. A strong pro-white bias, those with a strong pro-white bias spent more time looking at the good information of white candidates, and most importantly, our implicit and unconscious attitude directs our unconscious eye movements when we consider their CVs. So our rational decisions about the suitability of candidates are based on this bias pattern of fixation. This is the first time people have tried to unpick some of the processes here. Oh, another great book. Right. So kind of going into the final bit. So how do we encourage the green revolution? Well, we need to recognize that people have 2 minds, not one. We need to understand that many people have implicit and explicit attitudes that are dissociated. And these different attitudes direct behavior in different domains as a function of different variables. Especially when people are under any kind of cognitive or emotional load, the implicit system's more likely to operate. We need to find new ways of identifying these individuals, moving away from self-reports. We need to rethink how to do segmentation analysis. Now, let me just show you something very simple. A different way of doing a segmentation analysis might be something like this. This is just looking at the relationship between explicit and implicit attitudes. Now, let me say, incredibly, this has never been done before. Nobody's tried to take a population and say, what are their explicit attitudes like? What are their implicit attitudes like? And what are the implications for getting to those people? I mean, you think of the money that DEFRA and Tesco and others have spent, it's extraordinary. They haven't tried to consider this. Because if your explicit attitude is positive and your implicit attitude is positive, you are a true green. If your explicit attitude is positive but your implicit attitude is negative, you are a surface green. There are many of those in this room. If both are negative, you're a non-green. You don't care, and you really don't care. And then there are hidden greens. People say, listen, I don't really care about the planet, but deep inside you do. You might not even know how much you do. Now, the reason this is exciting was we got some money from Unilever to do some pilot research this year. Now, it's a truly multinational company. And they asked me to look at China, the US, India, and Brazil. And all they asked me to do was, on a relatively small sample, run these tests and say, what are the challenges? And I think everyone was kind of surprised when the results came back, because in a relatively small sample, the results were devastatingly significant. The Brazilian sample had the highest pro-high carbon implicit scores, and yet they report it being very pro-low carbon. The Chinese sample, their expressed preference wasn't so high, and they weren't as bad as the Brazilian sample. So in Brazil, because of all of the change in the culture, the rapid change, there is this incredible this longing, this lust for a high carbon lifestyle. So the challenge in Unilever doing something in Brazil, marketing their sustainable living plan, is going to be completely different. It changes everything in terms of how you get through to people. We need to understand how those with dissociated attitudes process incoming information. To me, that's one of the biggest intellectual challenges for the next 30 years, which is, it's all very well saying people have got the right attitude and all we have to do is give them information. If they're dissociated, how do we get through to them? Because to me, this puts the whole concept of cognitive dissonance in a completely new light. This is a really big challenge. What do these individuals see? And with Damien Litchfield, we're looking at that very topic. What do people notice when you profile them in this way? What do they pick up on? And we need to find new ways of changing implicit attitude. Laura's working on, she's going to be devising new films to show in schools to say, can you take kids and change their implicit attitudes by a systematic manipulation? And of course, we've got methods for measuring these now, so we'll know if they're working or not. In terms of racism, what do we need to do? Well, we all believe in equality, so we need to make sure there's more system 2 thinking. We need to interfere with the natural connection between implicit processes and behaviour. I've been on shortlisting committees where people have said, give me your first response to the candidates. Don't do that. That's your implicit system working. We need to interfere with the connection between unconscious and conscious behaviours. You need to make your thoughts conscious. If I see this, then I will do this. And we need to change contextual factors. No time pressure in shortlisting. Lower the cognitive and emotional load. But most importantly of all, and this is the kind of take-home message for tonight, we need to work on changing our implicit attitudes in this domain by changing those associative networks. And I think this, by definition, requires an interdisciplinary approach. And this university, in my opinion, could well take a lead on this. There's some good experimental work showing you can change implicit attitude. But what would it be like to change the implicit attitudes of a whole year cohort at this university? Could we do that? Could we make them? And could we monitor and measure it? Because we have the opportunities here, I think, because of powerful media, a whole range of disciplines that we could draw into this enterprise, get out of the lab to try and do this more systematically. Now, why do I think this is possible? Now, it's not just me who's trying to pull out on the commercial world. Melinda Gates has said something very similar recently. We're going to have to learn from the commercial world. And I think this is possible because of the literature on smoking. Now, I think it's the one positive legacy of the smoking industry. And I like to point out that some of the best psychologists in the last 100 years worked advertising smoking. I blame it all on J.B. Watson. And Watson famously, very famous founder of behaviorism, worked for Maxwell House. He developed the coffee break. That's one of his inventions. People hadn't had the concept before. Psychologists can do it. And I think if we can make people smoke, how do you get people to put a cancerous ember in their mouth? Well, it's quite complicated. You have to make them emotionally slightly nervous, and then you have to play about with the images of what smoking will give them, friends, company, all that kind of stuff, success. It's been done. What they did was they changed the associations. Marlboro, to begin with, was a feminine cigarette. They made it masculine by inventing the Marlboro Man, somebody who rounds up crazy horses and cattle. We can do this, but it's not going to be that rational approach of Tesco. Just give them the information. We need something more radical and very different. So the final slides. I call this talk The Divide Itself. I hope that I've convinced you that this is an accurate description. The subtitle of the talk was How a Better Understanding of the Human Mind Can Transform Society, a bit grandiose. But I believe that some positive transformation is possible. And these are challenges that these are challenges that we could meet head on. But that depends all of us, both inside and outside the academy. And the last thing is my acknowledgements, really. My two tutors as an undergraduate and postgraduate, two very influential psychologists in my area, David McNeil and Marcel Dennessy, Laura, who's worked with me for a number of years now, Damien, who's up there, and Melissa, who should have been up there but has moved on, Edgehill, John, George, and Philip in particular, and lastly, all the staff in the Department of Psychology who made me feel so welcome. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name's Kevin Burney, Associate Dean in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and it's my great pleasure this evening to give the vote of thanks for Geoff's lecture. As you probably know, Geoff's lecture is, in fact, one of a series of public lectures that we have on this term, and they range from a wide variety of subjects, from sport, performing arts, education, health, and of course psychology. But although the range of subjects is diverse, I think they all have a few things in common. First of all the lectures are underpinned by excellent cutting-edge research. Secondly, they all address the impact agenda, that is, the topics they cover aren't just of interest to other academics, but they're relevant to all of us and the wider needs of society. And lastly, too, I think all of the speakers really have that so important knack of being able to convey the importance of their subjects, their passion for their subjects and their research in a way that is accessible not just to other experts in their field, but to all of us here tonight. And I'm sure you will agree that Geoff has really admirably succeeded in meeting all of those objectives. As Associate Dean for Research, Geoff will know I won't pass up the opportunity to mention it in those REF results or REF Excellence Framework results that he referred to in his lecture, which we had just before Christmas, where an expert panel of our peers in other universities up and down the country assessed the research of our psychology department. 50% of their research was assessed as being internationally excellent or world leading. In respect to Geoff's topic, well, I don't think we can get anything more profound and important than climate change, sustainability, and race relations. And also, too, I think you will fully appreciate why, as George mentioned at the start, Geoff is so often invited to appear on television to talk about his topics, to talk about his research in a way that really makes it interesting for the ordinary viewer. So if you can join with me in thanking Geoff, I think, for what has been an entertaining, thought-provoking, and a very challenging lecture this evening. Now, we do in a few moments have some refreshments and some wine and mineral water outside for you. I hope no bananas. But before we partake of those, Geoff has kindly agreed to answer a few questions. So we do have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions if anyone wants to raise anything now. Don't be modest. Okay, and I should say that if you do stick up your hand for a question, if you can wait till the microphone reaches you before you ask it so that we do capture it for our cameras and our recording this evening.
Yeah, thanks very much, Geoff. It's going to be an eye-tracking question, it's got to be. You really nicely explained the differences between System 1 and System 2 processes, between non-verbal behaviour, what they say explicitly verbally versus not, and also between the IAT, what they report and how they respond very quickly. What else do you think we can do in terms of the eye movements to separate out those System 1 and System 2 processes so we can understand better that associative network was often activated?
Well, it's a great question, but I turn it back to you, Damien. You tell me. You're the expert. I should say Damien is the eye-tracking expert. I mean, it seems to me that the really interesting intellectual question that I'm, and I kind of hinted at it there, but I think we've only just scraped the surface, is I'm really interested in this connection between the two systems, in that, if the System 1 is playing such a role, and that associative machine over many years is predisposing us to doing all kinds of things, how do we deal with that in terms of being rational agents? And what's amazing is that, again, so much of what's exciting and interesting with psychology derives from Allport. Allport did a wonderful chapter in the 1950s called The Inner Conflict about the way that these systems can relate to each other. I mean, he didn't have the technology, he didn't have the vocabulary for doing it, but he still tried to uncover this discomfort that human beings have in going through life. And all I'm trying to use eye tracking for at the moment is this notion that we have to kind of make rational decisions. And to me, it was an extraordinary discovery that System 1, this associative thing was pushing you to notice some things about people you wanted to make a negative judgment about. And it seems to me that, from my point of view, that's what's really interesting, because it seems to me that eye tracking, because it forms the basis of what we say, and therefore forms the basis of our mental representations, has to be the conduit between the two systems. And that's my particular interest. Yours, I suspect, is different. I know yours is different, of course I do. So I'm not answering your question, but I'm just repeating what I've said, which is that's what excites me, which is, we cannot go through being driven by this unconscious associative machine to avoid bananas all night. We have to kind of say why we're doing it. So rationalizations are of interest to me, the whole cognitive machinery of how the two systems connect.
Okay, well, thanks. It just means we've got more research to do then, doesn't it? Okay, thanks.
Okay, so we have any more questions? Don't be shy.
It seems to me that people who have a marked disparity between their explicit and their implicit attitudes might be in a bit of an uncomfortable place. Is there evidence of that? Have you looked at that? And if so, what would you
No,
do?
I couldn't agree more. You would think that they would be in an uncomfortable place, and there's an enormous area in psychology called cognitive dissonance, looking at people in that uncomfortable place and how they make themselves more comfortable. In fact, some of the literature on cognitive dissonance suggests just getting people to express attitudes which aren't in keeping with their real attitudes, although people didn't use the IAT to measure them then, kind of makes you uncomfortable. But I keep thinking, what happens if we go through a world with a part of our representational system, the gestural system, depicting our real state of affairs? And this is, again, talking about new ideas. I mean, no one's ever thought that that might have implications for this level of discomfort. In that huge Festinger cognitive dissonance literature, people just say, get people to express it. But say I'm representing a part of this inner thinking gesturally. So I'm not covering it up. I'm telling you what I think. Are we close, madam? Yes, we are. Yes, we are. And so it's like part of that discomfort is dealt with because I'm kind of... Now, I don't know what the implications of that are, and that's something I would love to look at. In other words, do you get the same kind of attitude change, behavior change, when people can represent stuff in that way? That's one thing. But I do agree with you, generally speaking, you would think people would be in discomfort. But again, when it comes to the race stuff, you can see, using the eye tracking, that they're trying to kind of offload that discomfort in some way by finding the bad bits about those candidates they don't want to include anyway. And then say, didn't you notice their CV? Didn't you notice it? But it's the same bits on the white one, they just didn't look. It's a good question.
One more question.
Jeffrey, you know that I have a little bit of a different view about things. I think that psychologists tend to sometimes shy away from the unconscious, as you suggested, and also seem to maybe deny what much work in philosophy of mind might be presenting to us. So I just want you to speculate a little bit. You know, it's interesting to me because I have no concern about or difficulty with the research, that you've presented. All of that is really accurate and true. It seems to me that it's been repeated many times. But I think it's interesting, too, that even your implicit presentation, there was one slide where you mentioned something about how the brain works. And so I'm wondering about your views on the difference between brain and mind. And I guess what I'm getting at is a possibility that instead of the divided self being two minds, the possibility that divided self might be a division between the mind and the brain, which we wouldn't have conscious access to anyway. And there is a tradition that's developing, within psychology, considering the fact that the possibility that there might be what we might have considered before as an unconscious mind is really the brain operating. So here's the speculation I'm interested in. Is it possible, with all of your interest in, how we might retrain this associative machine and so forth to perhaps, operate in a more forgiving light? I'm wondering if it's possible, or what do you think about the possibility that we could bring to consciousness? If in fact that, for instance, consciousness is something that's evolved to become really what we are as human beings, and consciousness is our mind. And if the possibility exists that the unconscious is really the brain operating, and if we could separate philosophically those two things and rename your talk sort of the divided self between the brain and the mind, how might we retrain the brain by perhaps bringing to awareness what is going on in the brain, bringing it to awareness in the mind?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Obviously, I don't agree with your point of view, because obviously the brain's doing all of the work, both System 1 and System 2. But nevertheless, embedded within that, there are some very important questions. The reason I call it the divide itself was I like this notion that we see ourselves as rational creatures, not creatures of impulse, of total intuition, of associated reactions. So it just seems to me that our self-concept is based on one set of processes. But those processes are still mediated by the brain. I do take your point that consciousness is a very complex concept. And of course, as you know, there have been many speculations about the development of consciousness. And the argument, of course, in reading Greek literature, that the ancient Greeks didn't have a concept of consciousness. They thought whenever they had this internal dialogue, they thought it was the gods talking to them. So the idea was that Ulysses didn't really understand consciousness in the way that you or I would understand it. He thought the gods were talking all the time, which is why the Greek myths, there's so many, they seem to spend so much time having dialogues with God. I only have dialogues with God when I've done something bad. It's a different kind of process. So there's some interesting ideas there, but what I'm not talking about is the difference between the mind and the brain. I'm saying the brain mediates everything. And I'm saying our concept of self seems to be connected more to one system than to the other system. But I think there are interesting issues about how we can retrain consciousness in people, regardless of what system's operating.
Okay, well, I think we are just about out of time, really. We do, of course, have some refreshments waiting for you outside. I'm sure Geoff will be happy to take a few more questions over a glass of wine or so. But just before we partake of those, you can once again join me in thanking Geoff for this evening.
Too many slides. It was okay. It was good. It was serious enough, yeah.